And good evening, everyone, from Embry Riddle Aeronautical University. This is the President Speaker Series. My name is Marc Bernier. I'm an assistant to President Dr. John Johnson, and on behalf of Dr. Johnson and the entire management team here at Embry Riddle, we welcome you for the beginning of our Winter and Spring Series. Tonight, the first of several in the President Speaker's event for the spring of 2012, and we begin on American relations and being a good American Muslim. Our guest tonight is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. He practices internal medicine and nuclear cardiology in Phoenix. But his story is a remarkable one, of one whose family escaped Syria, came to this country to build a life, and then following the attacks of 9/11, became an outspoken American, a person who talks about the practice of being a good American and helping to shed light on American-Muslim relations. I want to thank our partners at Tiger Bay Club who brought in Dr. Jasser to be their keynote speaker tomorrow night at the at the Daytona Beach Shores Resort and Spa, and they were kind enough to share Dr. Jasser with us for this special live broadcast tonight on WNDB and here at Embry Riddle at the Gail Lemron Auditorium. We will look for the opportunity for phone calls for Dr. Jasser, and to anyone who's new to our format, it works like this. It's about an hour to an hour 20 minutes. It depends on the flow of questions. It will be led by me in the questions, and then we'll take comments, questions, and ideas from you in the audience for Dr. Jasser. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, I'd like to introduce our special guest for tonight, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming in from Phoenix to be with us.
You.
It's good to see you, sir.
It's nice to be with you, Mark. Thanks for having me with you.
Let's talk a little about, first, to give the background of life, what life was like in Syria, the Ba'ath regime, your family. What happened?
Well, my parents are from Syria. Grew up in Aleppo. My father went to medical school in Damascus. My mother went to pharmacy school, got her graduate degree in pharmacology. My grandfather, Zuhdi Jasser, was very politically active. The French were in control of Syria until World War II was completed, and then they pulled out in 1946. And for a few years, Syria, as many of the other Middle Eastern countries, dabbled with democracy and parliamentary government. But one of the lessons that my grandfather taught me young, which really led to me wanting to join the U.S. Navy, was that the militaries in most of these countries were run by the ignorant, corrupt thugs of society. So once the colonial powers pulled out, you had natural evolution of multiple military coups. And my grandfather, who was a very high-level politician in Aleppo, owned a newspaper, was very active in writing newspaper columns and editorials about democracy, was involved in government. There were a couple dictatorships initially after the French pulled out, but then there was a president by the name of Hashim al-Atassi who gave women the right to vote, was looking to have democratic reforms, but his presidency only lasted 2.5 years, and then there was another coup. There were about 19 presidents, dictators in Syria in just the 50s alone, with coup after counter-coup. And then in 1958, the Syrian government then merged with the Egyptian government and formed the United Arab Republic, which pretty much formed the step-off launching pad for socialist Ba'athist control of Syria. And with that, my grandfather then was in and out of house arrest. Every time he'd write a column under a pseudonym, they put him under house arrest, and it was this back and forth as my family fought with the regime there. My grandfather then had to leave Syria. My father stayed and actually finished medical school. But on the day of graduation from medical school, my father then escaped with my mom to Lebanon, did his internship in Beirut, and they came through the front door to the United States and became immigrants, and I was born a few months later. I've never been able to go to Syria myself. The closest I came was the Mediterranean when I served on the USS El Paso. The American taxpayer put me through medical school.
I was going to just wanted to let people know, in addition to his medical license and his work, for 12 years he served in the United States Navy. I think you were a lieutenant commander?
Yeah, I left as a lieutenant commander. Went to medical school from 88 to 92 at the University of Wisconsin, Medical College of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. And Nixon had started a health profession scholarship program to incentivize many of us to serve in a scholarship. And to me, it was a natural thing. I wanted to be a physician, and the scholarship allowed me to serve my country. And you know, from the lessons I learned from my grandfather and my parents, America is successful not only because of our principles and our founding fathers and the Constitution, but it's successful because the military is truly a cross-section of the American population. If ever You know, if you look in the Middle East, in these countries that have this corrupt, I mean, if you see what's happening in Syria today, the military shooting at innocents in the streets, they really have no value for human life. Many countries can have on paper constitutions like ours, but unless the people are educated, moral, understand the rule of law, etc., it's not worth the paper it's written on. And Syria right now is going through these convulsions of hopefully changing. And we can get into, you know, what that process is like.
I wanted to stay with that and ask you, where do you see the situation with Syria going, knowing how delicate our relationship is, the United States, with Syria?
I wish my grandfather was alive to see what's happening, because I'll tell you, in the Jasser household, when my parents left, you know, initially they would always say, well, at some point every people deserve the government it has. And that sounds like a harsh thing to say. But I think today, if he was alive, he'd be saying, you know, finally the Syrians are waking up. Because there have been lots of disasters, and Hama was wiped out in 1982. 40,000 people were killed in 2 weeks. And you're seeing now over 6,000 have been killed in the last 9 months. 20 to 50,000 have been displaced, if not more. We don't even know the numbers because there's no journalists. So right now in the Middle East, you have basically this binary choice, where they've had secular fascist regimes like Saddam Hussein, which was Ba'ath. You have Hafiz Assad and his son Bashar, which are Ba'athists, and Alawites, really, from a more minority sect. And in Egypt, you had Mubarak. These are all not religious people. These are secular fascists. But what's happened is, in the environment, which many of us have called this sort of nuclear political winter, where nothing could grow, you've had an equal and opposite alternative, which is theocratic fascism. In Iran, it got merged into one government. In Saudi Arabia, you have a monarchy which pretends to be religious but really isn't, but has a deal with the devil, with the Wahhabis, and have allowed the Wahhabis to run the government, not to run the government, to run the judicial system and the legal system. In Egypt, you had the Mubarak regime that had this love-hate relationship with the Brotherhood. They basically would imprison them and destroy them when they got in the way, but they'd also basically opened the way to creating an ideology that fostered the Brotherhood and radical Islamism. A perfect example is, as much as Mubarak was secular, he would show the protocols of the Elders of Zion every year in Ramadan, which is one of the most hateful anti-Semitic films ever made. He would do things that would foster an Islamist ideology in the largest leading Islamic educational centers in Cairo, whether it's Al-Azhar. Qardawi, who is the leading imam for the Brotherhood globally, came out of that Egyptian environment. Sayyid Qutb and the whole Muslim Brotherhood movement came out of that environment. So when you ask me what's going to happen in Syria right now, and understandably, often in America we say, well, we're afraid of what's going to come next. But you have to remember, it's sort of like the alcoholic and abusive parents that have been keeping their kids locked in the basement and abusing them for 10 years. You can't continue to condone that behavior because you're worried about how dysfunctional the kids are going to be when they get out. I mean, you have to allow them to be free and start creating environments where they can become more functional. And if these societies are going to become functional, I think Syria is probably the country that could become the most functional in the Middle East because it's the most diverse. You have 60% Sunni Muslim, you have 10% Alawites, 10% Druze and Christian, and you have 5 to 10% Kurdish. So because of that huge, and this is the environment my grandfather and my family came from, which was a very diverse. I mean, my grandfather, some of his closest friends in Aleppo were Jewish businessmen and women, and now they're not there. There's hardly any Jews left in Syria. And I think that environment has to come back, and if it's going to come back, it's going to come not with this current dictatorship. The Brotherhood, I mean, now there's the Syrian National Council. We've been very involved, actually, in trying to create an alternative to that, because the Syrian National Council has been very much led by Islamists. And I think part of the reason the Islamists have taken over in Tunisia, and they are slowly in Egypt, and they may in Syria, is because our government has been 10-foot pole type policy where we're not being involved, we're not taking sides, we think democracy is simply elections, and that somehow because people go vote, that's not democracy, that's mobocracy, right? I mean, we learned in this country that democracy involves minority rights, a Bill of Rights. We had to go through our own civil war, a civil rights movement, until we really started to understand what our Constitution meant. And I think similarly, we have to take sides in the Middle East, and Syria is one of those examples.
We should tell you that Dr. Jasser is a frequent guest on Fox News, CNN, CBS News, MSNBC. His story was so compelling that I got up at 3 o'clock this morning, thinking about his speeches, because I've seen some of your talks, and I looked at the third jihad, and I looked at it in segments, which is a video that everybody here should see, get a copy of, because and I see some people in the audience nodding their heads, they've seen it. I did not know until I watched that in Bethlehem, I believe it was reported, only 15% of the people who live in Bethlehem are Christian now.
It's
That's
even becoming
astonishing.
less. I mean, in Gaza and the West Bank, it used to be 15%. Now it's down to 1 to 2%. And this exodus of Christians from Muslim-majority areas is really why we're doing the work we're doing at the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, and why we helped with the movie The Third Jihad, is that this environment in the Middle East has created this two-headed snake of theocratic fascism and secular fascism, and there has to be a third pathway of liberty and freedom, and you can't fertilize the ideas of liberty in an environment that thrives on sectarian violence, where you see in Nigeria now, over Christmas, there were churches that were bombed and fired, and everywhere where you unroof dictatorship or you take away military control, you end up seeing this sectarian violence. In Iraq, I think it was very unwise for us to pull out of there. As much as I supported what we did in Iraq, there's a lot to be said that there needs to be a lot of chaperoning in that area for a while until you can allow institutions to be built that will foster democracy. Our democracy is only successful because we have an educated population that understands what it is to argue law based in reason. That kind of concepts have not been able to grow. I mean, we can only do our work at AIFD in America. If I had to do the work that I'm doing against political Islam and for reform in Egypt or Iraq, we wouldn't last. My life expectancy would be 3 to 6 months.
I don't know how you're doing it now, because you have the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. You're practicing medicine, and it's not simple medicine. And when I check, aren't you still the head of the Arizona Medical Association?
No, I was head from 06 to 07, and I am involved with the AMA. I'm an alternate delegate to the AMA for Arizona. You only live once. I've got good staff. I work at 4 days full-time in my practice. In the evenings and early in the mornings, we meet with our nonprofit and do the media work. Luckily, we're in Phoenix time, so a lot of the media work we do is on East Coast mornings, so before my practice starts. But, this is a passion. If I was 20, 25, I probably would be a little more focused, but I think at this point, I wrote a book called The Battle for the Soul of Islam that'll be out this summer, and in it I basically dedicated it to my children, because right now my biggest fear is that they will not have a place that they can learn about their faith and learn about America in a context that allows them to be at peace with both. Because currently, those that are leading many of the mosques, not all of them, many of the mosques and some of the Islamic organizations look upon America and life in the West as sort of this antagonism where, well, we live here, we accept the laws because we're a minority. Yes, it's wonderful, we have freedom, but ideally we'd rather live in an Islamic state, or ideally Islamic law is better. And I think as my kids get exposed to American history, Western history, the history of reform, the history of the Church of England, and a lot of the reforms that Christianity went through and the Christian society did, I think we can emulate some of that as Muslims and say that how do we also take our scripture and read it through the lens of history and separate principles that are based on the God of Abraham from historical aspects that are related to some passages that are simply historical and don't relate necessarily to today anymore. And I think that type of separation of history from religion is important. And I dedicated it because I think if you look at most of the books that are about Islam and Muslims, etc., it comes out of petrodollars. It comes out of the Wahhabi interests of trying to imperialize the world into an Islamic hegemony. And it doesn't look at a spiritual, humble faith that is all about individual rights and humanitarianism, etc. It looks at it more from a utopian standpoint. And I think this type of philosophy, and I'm not saying it doesn't exist. There are many Muslim thought leaders that formed the way I think. Ibn Abu Zayd, Muhammad al-Ashmawi, so many Sufi thinkers. There are a lot of Islamic thinkers, but you just don't hear about them because they're not well funded nowadays. And this is why the institutions that we need to build, and I give time to my mosque, to my family, and I think part of this is what's your legacy? And believe me, I do more than 40 hours a week in my medical practice, and my patients are still my first passion. But after that, it's in this work that I do in reform and looking at my faith and how it merges with America, it doesn't take me that much work. It's just natural. It's something that was something I've been bred, if you will, my whole life to deal with.
Dr. Zuhdi Jasser is our guest. For the radio audience that may be just joining us, your story is a remarkable one. And to get to some basics, because when we were first invited to do this with you, and I thought, what a wonderful opportunity, I thought, I wonder what Muslim people who are not violent against other Americans, what do they think? Do they feel they're victims of bad press, that there's extreme prejudice? Some basics, doctor. What's it like? I mean, you're high profile and you're a physician, but for the average American Muslim who wants to live in peace in this country, what's life like for them?
Well, I think that, it's not much different than anybody else. And, I grew up in a small town in Wisconsin. There were 3 or 4 other Muslim families. Probably the toughest part of growing up was not the fact that I was Muslim, but that my name was Zuhdi, and it's not a very typical name in Wisconsin. So
do they confuse it with Pakistan, Saudi Arabia?
I mean, they knew it was not a Anglo-Saxon name. But it depends on what your attitude is. I grew up, was told by my parents that you sort of take these things in stride, and it's better to laugh with them rather than feel like you're being targeted, and that stood me well through my time in the Navy. And I remember when I showed up on my ship, the colonel who was the Marine leader on the, we were on a Navy ship, but we took Marines to various operations, and I took care of the Marines on there as a doc. The first day he met me, he came into my sick bay, and he said, "Are you the new doc?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "What's your name?" And I said, "Zuhdi Jasser." He said, "Did your parents hate you?" And I'm like, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, I've never heard of that name before." So I explained to him that I was very proud of my name.
Were you born, though, as Muhammad?
Yeah, my first name is Muhammad. Now, many Muslims whose first name is Muhammad will use their middle name because Muhammad is the most common name in the world. So it is, so that if you call Muhammad in Aleppo, Syria, so that half the neighborhood doesn't turn around and say, "What?" Most people use their middle name. And not to mention Zuhdi was my grandfather's first name. So often if you're going to name your child Muhammad, you'll use it as a first name just out of respect, but use the middle name. But growing up, I'll tell you, I had the same struggles. Everybody collected football cards, played American sports, and I had conservative family values, and this is where sometimes it sort of befuddles me it's very puzzling to see so many American Muslims now veering so far to the left politically, because really when it comes to our social and family values, it's very conservative, very family oriented. I've never drank, dating was pretty much limited to, intent for marriage. So that's how I was raised, and it's basically no different than if you talk to Orthodox Jewish families, very conservative Christian families. I mean, they have the same type of values. And to me, it was interesting. I almost had more in common with the very conservative Christian and Jewish families than some of the Muslim families who may not have been practicing Muslims, but were just much more, free living.
Is part of what your forum does is try to straighten people out in terms of what Syrian people or Muslim people are really all about? And I'll tell you why. In running this by people who are not very educated on you, I just said, this is who's coming, this is what we're talking about. And invariably, more often than not, I got people who appear to be suspicious.
Yeah.
Are a lot of Americans, to be totally direct to you, Doctor, under the impression that all Muslims just want to kill us?
Well, this is the problem. And, I've seen the country, and if you look at the constituencies that I feel like I'm serving in this, there's 2. The Muslim constituency is the constituency that I think the majority agree with what I'm saying, but yet don't feel that it's a problem enough that they're going to take time away from work and family to do this. They feel that, well, I came to this country because I wanted to get away from the Islamists and the ideologues, and they see what happens to me and how I'm targeted by many of these groups, and they don't want to get on that into that pressure. But they also don't see that if you look at what's happening in the Middle East, we are the only ones that can fix this. This is not a problem that can be fixed by non-Muslims, because there's a reform, there's a mindset that has to happen, and a separation of mosque and state. Our organization's primary mission is to separate mosque and state. That ultimately the concept in our Constitution of the Establishment Clause, I believe, is what made America truly a land based on liberty and freedom, under God, but with a separation of church and state. Not free from religion, but freedom of religion. And that kind of concept is very new to Muslims. So what happens is many Muslims are so right now, because of this concept of being attacked and being looked upon as being the enemy, etc., they're looking to organizations that are all victim-based organizations that are all about supposedly about civil rights, etc., which I think are actually hurting us, balkanizing us as Muslims, separating us, and actually radicalizing Muslims, because the more you perpetuate the narrative that we are victims, it makes us less do the hard work of reform that actually is treating the problem. So if you look at the larger, the 98.5% of America that are non-Muslim, I'll tell you, a lot of the people that are non-Muslim that support us do so because they understand that the only way to get beyond the fear and the suspicion is that people start to see that there are Muslims who we need to lead this battle, because non-Muslims cannot fix this. And if we start to realize that it's Muslims that are going to solve this problem, then if you antagonize every Muslim you see by making them appear to be stealth jihadis or stealth threats, then you are going to end up alienating the most important tools that you need. So that's our primary message to the non-Muslim audience. But having said that, you have to engage Muslims in ideology, because political Islam is a theopolitical ideology. So it's going to masquerade as religion when you start looking at it. It's going to masquerade as a political ideology when they want to control a society by collectivism in a very socialistic mindset.
We're going to take questions from the audience for those who may be just joining us for Dr. Jasser later, so be thinking of your question. And then Alyssa Burden will come by with a microphone, and you can ask your question directly of Dr. Jasser. I was thinking as you were speaking about this change, this balkanization that you were referring to, and I was thinking about the fact that we have extremists in every faith, in every ethnicity. But first, is it the fastest growing religion on the planet? Is it the fastest growing faith, the Muslim faith, in its various formats?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, a lot of the, and some of the things that this theopolitical movement I talked about, in many ways what they are is evangelical Islam, because they want to spread Islam, and they look upon the best way to do that is through a political and a theological movement. Those numbers are not really, our organization is not a proselytizing organization. It's very hard. It's easy to take that number and say that it's true, but I think what happens is Christianity gets an unfair representation there, because it gets divided into Methodist and Baptist and Catholic and all the different divisions, while Muslims really just have Shia and Sunni. So it's probably easier to track those numbers. But to me, we have many people from the evangelical community, Orthodox communities that support us, because they say, Zuhdi, I may disagree with your theology, because clearly, for example, the concept of Jesus Christ, we disagree between Christianity and Judaism about Jesus' role. But having said that, at the end of the day, we want to help create a society where you have a free market of ideas, where you can all evangelize. We can all, talk about what we want, what our faith is, without feeling that somebody's going to kill somebody because you drew a cartoon of their a prophet, or somebody's going to actually do anything violent, or there's going to be a law. I mean, right now, Secretary Clinton had a conference just last week in Washington where OIC was brought in and invited, where we ended up apologizing about what the West is saying and doing about Islam in this Islamophobia conference. And, at the end of the day, I don't think that this type of appeasement is going to work. And I think, more to your question, how do we approach, is it truly interfaith work, or is it actually, the problem with interfaith work is that we deal too much with the positivity and not enough with critical thinking, and we've lost the skills as Americans of actually being able to talk about religion in a way that exposes the differences so that we know what common grounds we share, but also where the differences are. And I think so many Muslims have taken things like the Oklahoma law and others and made it seem like it's anti-Muslim, when in fact there's so many Americans out there trying to get their mind around, well, what's the threat? It's not terrorism, it's not violence. Violence doesn't, Nidal Hassan, the psychiatrist who has a bio that's frighteningly similar to mine, did not go to bed one night a normal, wonderful, compassionate psychiatrist and wake up the next day a jihadist that wanted to kill his fellow soldiers. There was a process of radicalization that happened over 10, 15 years. And I believe, and this is why our Muslim Liberty Project at AIFD is the heart of what we do, I believe that started when he was 10, 12, 15, where he was told by his parents or by his community that America is anti-Islam, America is an anathema to our faith, America is against, it's part of some conspiracy, and they lump in the Israeli issues and all these things into that, and it becomes this problem where youth don't have an identity. And once a youth does not identify with the society in which he lives, he's ripe for radicalization, because he or she can then say that, oh, all of a sudden this country's against them, they're attacking them, and every citizen becomes a soldier and they can attack them in a form of terrorism.
Forgive me, because I want to stop you right there, because you raised an important point. If it takes 10 to 15 years for this to build up, were we asleep at the wheel as American service personnel that we weren't seeing the signs? Because there had to be some kind of signs over a period of time that something's not right here.
Well, asleep at the wheel on every front, Mark. I mean, we were asleep at the wheel. This guy gave a presentation. I mean, I know what medical grand rounds are. He was supposed to give a grand rounds where I trained at Bethesda or at Walter Reed on psychiatry and post-traumatic stress disorder. And he said, you know what, I'm going to talk today about jihad and the Quran. And his business card at Walter Reed said, Soldier of Allah, S-O-A. And nobody said anything. And if you ask them, the after-action report is even more of an embarrassment. The 82-page after-action report from the Pentagon, the word Islam, Muslims, jihad, Islamism doesn't appear in the report. The guy's name doesn't appear in the report. So how do you have millions of dollars, generals with multiple stars on their shoulders that put this report together about what happened, what went wrong, and they were citing that his 05s and 06s that were training him were the ones that really did the mistake because they should have counseled him or done something, when in fact they themselves exhibited behavior in the after-action report that shows that they're not in an environment where they can say anything. So as a result, do you think if I was chief resident at Bethesda, do you think if I had a resident there who had been doing something like that, you'd be worried about what would happen to you if the cares of the world started suing you or saying that you as a government employee were targeting somebody because of their faith? One good example is look at Chaplain James Yee from Guantanamo was noted to be removed and was removed from the military and now is doing book tours and doing the speaking circuit for CARE, etc. And he says that he was targeted because he was Muslim. And the Wall Street Journal had a good op-ed that said, imagine Nidal Hassan if somebody had complained about it and had removed him just a month before he did what he did. And what different pathway may have happened in the evolution of the Nidal Hassan story.
Before we get to the theme, which is to be a good American Muslim, I want to ask you, in an extreme case, in a faith that's supposed to be based, and I have been given a copy of the Quran and have read some, based on love and truth and honor and family and value and modesty, how do you make the leap, if you're really religious, to what are known as honor killings? It's just, it escapes me, and forgive me, I don't have the training, I'm not in theology, but how could we possibly get to a point where a father in this country who is a Muslim kills his daughter in what is called an honor killing? That's not prescribed in the Quran, is it?
Well, again, Mark, no, absolutely not in the Quran that I understand. Again, I would tell you that this is there's a continuum there. The number of honor killings has been increasing. There were over 5,000 globally in the last year alone. In America, we're starting to hear and see more of it. I think part of it is a reporting phenomenon. I think it's always been there, but we just haven't heard about them. But at the end of the day, honor killings is to women's rights what terrorism is to political movements for Islamists. Meaning that what happens is, and this is actually one of the focuses of when I sat down to write my book, I spent more time talking about this issue than really getting into what Quranic scripture is. The reason is because think about every religious person you know in your life, whether they're Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, Mormon, whatever their faith is. If your kids grew up with their kids, most of the time when you knew somebody was a good Christian or a good Jew or a good Muslim, they didn't really understand their scripture that well yet. By the time they really could start to understand and do scriptural exegesis, who they are as a good moral human being had been pretty much set in stone. That by the time you're 14, 15, your conscience, your superego, your relationship with God, yes, some of that's starting to take place, but you read your text through the lens of your personal moral compass, your superego. So to say somehow that you can take a normal, compassionate person and give him a Quran and turn him into Al-Qaeda is just, that's just not right. Now the Saudi government, the Saudi society could turn somebody into Al-Qaeda, but that's not just the Quran. That's a society that has educational systems, that has an environment that teaches the supremacism that will slowly indoctrinate people. It's a process of indoctrination. So yes, there are passages that are pretty harsh in the Quran. But I think other scripture has some harsh. Now the harsh passages, I believe, are where God is telling an individual what happens to you if you don't believe in me. It's not government telling you. It's not society telling you what happens. So that's a very personal decision. And there's other passages that say that God tells me as a Muslim, if I wanted to make you a Muslim, I would have, but I did not. It's basically your choice. So unless God is schizophrenic, you can't have some passages that say there's no compulsion and then other passages that say if you reject me you will go to hell and you will burn. And you have to find a way to have a common interpretation of all those passages.
To stay on the religious piece for just a moment here, because you've hit on an important theme once again. As Christians believe that only Jesus Christ gets them to heaven. He is the only way that acts on earth. If those people who truly follow the Bible are those who truly follow the Quran, believe that only through the Quran's message do you get to obtain a higher end.
That's a great question, and to me that's part of the reform that we're trying to do, is this concept of exclusivity, of ownership of heaven and the hereafter. Certainly that's part of the Al-Qaeda narrative, which is, they believe, the Wahhabis really, the Wahhabi doctrine, which was Al-Qaeda, came out of that Wahhabi doctrine, is that even Christianity, which we recognize in Islam as people of the book, I mean, we're allowed to marry as Muslims, Christian and Jews, and allow our children to be raised without having to convert, you know, by a Jewish or a Christian mother, because in the Quran it tells us that they believe in the same God. But yet, is there a different level of, you know, if we believe that Islam was the only way, then it would say that that mother would have to convert, and that doesn't say that. Now, as far as exclusivity is concerned, we do not believe that. I believe in the version, in my version of Islam, my Islam versus somebody else's Islam, is that we don't have a monopoly on God, and that ultimately, as long as you believe in the God of Abraham, you will go to heaven, depending on that pathway. And only God knows how much of the knowledge you've gotten is enough to be accountable for it. So we differ with Christianity, and I think we're much closer probably to Judaism as far as that concept of exclusivity or non-exclusivity. Now, as far as, now one of the things the Wahhabis say is, well, there's no more Christians around because the Christians created the Trinity. True Christians that existed at the time of Jesus don't exist, so therefore all Christians now are infidels or non-believers because they've created polytheism in the Trinity. Well, that is actually patently irrational, because the whole reason Islam came to be, according to us, is because of these changes, the concept of original sin, the deification of Jesus, the Trinity, etc. If what they're saying is true, you have a circular argument, and then all of Islam would not have had to be revealed because we'd be Christians.
I read somewhere where Muslim people in the region in Syria can relate somehow to Catholics. They don't look at them as infidels. They look at them, and you can correct me on this, as, well, they went the wrong path. They got a good idea, but they're off a little bit. They don't hate them. They don't hate Catholics. They understand them. They just have a different faith.
Oh, I mean, I think it's
a lot
much
of Catholics
stronger than
Syria.
that. We have, I mean, I get more calls sometimes on our holidays from my Catholic, Arabic, Lebanese friends than I do from my Muslim friends.
Okay.
You know, if you go to a Catholic Arabic service in Lebanon, the word Allah is used frequently, and the Arabic prayers that they do, you'd have a hard time. I mean, I'm not an expert in classical Arabic, but you'd have a hard time sometimes telling the difference, because the prophets are similar, the stories are the same. So there's a lot of common heritage there.
Before we go to the audience, would you showcase some of the basis of when you speak around the world about what it takes to be a good American Muslim? What do you need to have in your mind?
Yeah, I think that the key to that is, and you know, this is such an area that can be quicksand, because once somebody starts talking about what it takes to be patriotic or a good American, you know, that's very presumptuous, and I think you know, patriotism is something that should be described posthumously and not during your life. But having said that, I think, you know, one of the things we've lost and that I do talk about frequently is, I tell people, you don't have to become experts in Islam. I'd like you to go back and just relearn American history and what it is to be an American. And I think that's the part about what I'm trying to teach the Muslim community, at least the ones that listen and engage us, is that go to mosque, read your Quran, that's fine. Go back and read Jefferson's papers on religious freedom. Read Bastiat's The Law from Europe and Hayek and a lot of the, you know, Locke and some of our founding fathers, Madison. There was a debate that Madison had with George Mason, where there was a debate about the role in which religion, the word Christian, would play in the Constitution. And they talked about whether, and basically to me as a Muslim, it's like if you had Christianists, if that exists, versus the liberal Christian, and not non-practicing, but those that wanted to separate church and state. That debate to me is what we need to have in the Islamic community. So to be a good American and a good Muslim means that I want to live in an environment, a laboratory that allows me to either accept or reject my faith, that allows me to choose in Ramadan whether I want to fast or not. My mother taught me that the reason I can be as good a Muslim here than anywhere in the world is because in Saudi Arabia, when it's Ramadan, businesses are closed during the day, so people are sleeping, they're up at night, so fasting is not a challenge. To you, religious practice should be a challenge. So if you're going to be a good Muslim, you need to live in a laboratory that gives you a challenge to that, and freedom is that laboratory. So being a good American and a good Muslim is about understanding that this, even if Muslims were 90% of the population or 1%, I would still want the same legal system, the same society, and my pride and patriotism in this country is based on that, not the fact that I don't want the word Islam in the Constitution, I don't want the word Muslim. I want a document that applies to atheists, applies to everybody equally, and that's why this country is so successful.
Do you find that as you speak with people with this message, you have your greatest success with young people? That older people tend to be, you run into more hardliners, or does it matter? Do age groups enter into this?
It matters a lot. Our Liberty Project, after some few years of growth, has now focused on 15 to 30, 35 at the most. Initially, after 9/11, we thought that when we formed, you know, we sat in 2000 and for a few months, about 9 families got together and determined our list of principles that we wanted. Separation of mosque and state, equality of men and women, non-exclusivity, some of these principles that all of our members sign on to. And we thought that there'd be droves of Muslims joining us, and it just has not been the case. It has been a lot harder going. And, you know, I could talk for a while about what those causes are, but at the end of the day, we did determine, and why now one of the main things I'd like to do is engage imams in public debates, Lincoln Douglas type debates, and we've been doing a lot of those, because there's really a sense that they need to focus just on violence. That as long as we get rid of the ones that want to do it through violence, you know, then that's the problem. That, you know, we love this country, we want to live by the laws, but, well, if it's Egypt and it's majority Muslim, maybe they need to have an Islamic state. What's wrong with that? That's what we need to debate. And teaching older Muslims that are my age or my parents' age that somehow Western society is better and that America is a very religious country. It's not sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's not the way Al Jazeera paints it, and it's not the way the Islamists paint it. I mean, devout Christians are going through the same machinations in America, being very frustrated with the secularization of America. So that doesn't make it not religious. And this same debate, you know, is ranging.
You just said the magic phrase, Al Jazeera, and I wanted to ask you, do they help along this way, or do they cloud the issue?
Oh, they're very unhelpful. And, you know, some have said, and I think it was unfortunate, even my senator from Arizona, McCain, and Secretary Clinton and others recently credited Al Jazeera with a lot of the Arab Spring and opening the media. That's true in some ways, in that, but remember, even Syria, the first 3 months of the revolution, Al Jazeera said nothing. And then all of a sudden they found that it was getting to a threshold where they could take on Assad, and they switched. Al Jazeera is the propaganda arm for the Muslim Brotherhood. Qaradawi, who I mentioned to you before, left Egypt in 1961 and went where? He went to Qatar. Al Jazeera is run by the Qatari family. It's owned by the Qatari family, royal family, and it is a, Qaradawi has every week a show called Sharia in Life, that, and there's a lot written about what is taught there and what is put out on their airwaves. But basically, yes, they do talk about democracy, they talk about modernization, but it's basically political Islam 4.0. It's basically the third jihad, that they're expanding the Islamic State concept and helping the monarchies, etc. So the problem is we've not had a counter to it. We've not had a Radio Free Europe in Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the Gulf states. We've not had, and the reason is we don't have the skill sets. You can't just take, Americans that are Christian and put them on talking about freedom in Qatar against Al Jazeera. You have to have Muslims that understand this, getting into the language that's the Arabic language, these ideas. And you can't do it. I mean, Al Hurra, our station that you've all been paying for in Iraq, has the ratings of the NASA channel, and nobody watches it. But yet, so how do you do this? You have to get pundits and organizations that get on Al Jazeera. Now, it's interesting. I had a very difficult time getting on Al Jazeera with our anti-Islamist message. But with Syria now, finally, we've been on 5-6 times. Because the Brotherhood wants to see the Assad regime go down. And sure, I'll take the time to do that and join them in that fight. But when we talk about Islamism, I will point out while I'm on Al Jazeera that the Syrian National Council is run by the Brotherhood and an Islamist influence, etc.
We're going to go to the audience. If you have a question, raise your hand. We're going to go right to you. 1 second. I have one question before we start, because I know everyone's going to have stuff for Dr. Jasser. I was thinking about Syria, North Korea, the axis of evil. Why is it that they cling together, they relate, even though they have different cultures, different faiths, they have different interests? Is it that leadership in Syria and North Korea figure like, well, we're ostracized in our neighborhood, so we'll cling to each other? Why are they drawn together? They're so far away.
Well, Iran is a good example. Iran now, if you want to look at one reason why Syria has been so prolonged in its revolution, it's been Iran. Iran has been fueling them and providing snipers and Republican Guard and others there that have been just fueling continued, because Iran has had Assad as one of its allies for a long time and is looking to control. I mean, it's interesting. You have two Cold Wars happening. You have an internal Cold War in the Middle East where you have a triangulation in the Middle East between Iran and Syria, the Gulf states, and Turkey. Right now, Turkey and the Gulf states are working together. And you see Turkey helping Syria, helping the opposition in Syria because it wants to prevent Iranian influence in that region. But you wait a decade or so, Turkey will turn on the Gulf states in Egypt because they seek an automation of the Middle East to have Turkish, ultimately, Turkish influence across the Middle East. Same thing with Iran. You have this old historical, from the time of the Prophet, conflict between the Shia, sectarian differences with the Sunnis, etc. And that's why you saw this assassination attempt between Iran and the Saudi prince. And we've always just taken sort of the lesser of two evils, and because of oil, we've sided with the Saudis, etc. But, that relationship, look where that got us with Al-Qaeda, etc. So that triangulation. Now, there's a bigger Cold War, which is this division of the world between Islam and everything outside Islam and the Islamic states. And the perfect example of that is the existence of the OIC. Why on earth would you get a bunch of countries that have very little in common to form a conference, which is the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, now it's called, which is 56 countries that really are all a conglomeration of dictatorships for the most part, that recently went in with the Arab League, which is another group of dictators that went in to do observation in Syria, which was basically giving Assad another few weeks to try to clean up his country. So at the end of the day, I mean, there was nothing that horrified me more than seeing Barbara Walters give an interview to Bashar Assad. Because she went and said, boy, afterwards she was talking on ABC about how normal he was and how bizarre, how disconnected he was from his population. And I sort of thought to myself, imagine a reporter interviewing a serial killer who happened to be a doctor and saying that how normal he seemed, etc. I mean, a lot of these dictators seem normal. And some of them get trained and educated in America. There are many Saudi princes that came to Harvard and Johns Hopkins and Cambridge and got their degrees and went back to continue the fascism that their family started. So moral compass does not equate to education. And a lot of these guys will work with the Hugo Chavez's of the world, the dictators will work together to maintain their influence so that they can control the UN and prevent the pressure from the free world that they would make them change.
This powerful speaker, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, for our radio audience just joining us, is the keynote speaker tomorrow night at the annual Tiger Bay dinner. So for those of you who have tickets already, you're going to hear a wonderful presentation. Let's go in the audience now. Our first question of the night for Dr. Jasser. Hello, Becky.
Hello. Dr. Jasser, thank you for coming. I have been watching All American Muslim. It's a TV series. And in that series, the Muslim people drink alcohol and they smoke some kind of a pipe. What kind of a pipe is that?
Wow, I never would have guessed. My mother would be laughing if she heard that. That's a hookah, as it's called in the Western dialect. In Arabic, we call it an argile, which basically is a tobacco, a scented tobacco. It's not marijuana. It's not anything illegal. It's just a tobacco that is scented and is part of the... There's actually, it's one of the vogue things in the West now is to have hookah bars where you go in and you have those. You know, that program, it's interesting. You know, in many ways, it's interesting. Before it got all this controversy, when Lowe's and other wanted to pull their did pull their advertising from it, most of the Islamist groups in America were against that program because of these things, because it showed Muslims not being very religious and orthodox, etc. But now they all seem to love it because, you know, the advertisers were pulled, and, you know, I for one didn't like the program because it made it seem like somehow the way to normalize Muslims in America is to make them seem regular old kids that have vices. That if you show that if a Muslim has a vice, that somehow that normalizes them. I'm sorry, what we need is a program that shows Muslims with developing counterterrorism units or developing, having debates with imams, women trying to argue with their parents. I mentioned the slippery slope towards honor killing. Way short of honor killing are women that get told if they get pregnant, they get locked up in the room for 9 months so that nobody sees that they're pregnant. If they decide to date somebody non-Muslim, their parents shun them and sometimes will kick them out of the house and they have to live somewhere else. Those parents don't go and they would never kill their daughter, but yet they treat them in a way that ostracizes them and creates a lot of pathology. And that's what we have to deal with. I mean, there was a scene in that show where the imam on the program, there was a couple that was infertile, and they came to talk to the imam, and the imam told him, well, if you would, he told the lady, if you wore a hijab, you would become fertile probably, so please wear the hijab. I mean, I have a lot of ladies in my family that wear the hijab, and that's offensive to them. It's a choice, it's a personal religious practice. To think that somehow that would make you fertile is just absurd.
Let's go back to the audience now. Once again, Lissa, good evening, sir.
First, I want to thank you very much for coming tonight. I think you're a very, very brave man and doing a great job. But I don't think we can judge a religion by a person's action. We should judge a religion by the book that he follows and the founder. We should judge Christians by the Bible and by Jesus. We should judge Muslims by, or the Islamic religion, not Muslims. We don't want to judge Muslims. The Islamic religion by the Quran and by action of Muhammad. I find in the Quran some of the most evil verses I've ever read. Do not take Christians and Jews for your friends. Kill the idolaters. Kill the pagans. I mean, it's throughout there. If you look at the number of suicide, and it can't be called suicide killing because they can't go to heaven unless they kill somebody, but the people that give their life for Allah so they can go to heaven and get 72 virgins, the belittlement of women in the Quran and the Hadith, that's surprising. I've studied the Quran for about 8 or 10 years and talked to many people, and I believe what David Wood says. I don't believe Islam is truly a religion because Muhammad was never a prophet. I don't know, you're such a wonderful person. I don't know how you can hang on to what you're hanging on to.
I mean, according to your rationale that you just give, then I must be some type of mutation that came out of a faulty experiment, because On the one hand, you're using the justification to demonstrate your interpretation by the product of suicide bombers, etc. So you can't say that you judge the religion by its book and then demonstrate that your judgment is based on the production of suicide bombers. So I would tell you that there's nothing else in life that we do that way, number one. Number two, how else can you learn what the book says unless you actually look at the way it's interpreted? So I'm not disagreeing with you. There are many Muslims that interpret it the way you just said. There's no doubt. That's the way Al-Qaeda, that's the way the Wahhabi interpretation is, etc. I would submit to you that probably 95% of what you're calling Quran is somebody's English translation of it, okay? So let's say the passage you said, don't take Muslims, don't take Christians and Jews as friends. I know that passage very well. In Arabic, the word that's being called friends is awliya, okay? Awliya, a wali in Arabic is somebody's legal sponsor. It's not friend. Friend is rafi. There's other words for friend. That's not what it says in Arabic. It's a legal sponsor. So let's say I'm Catholic and I want to have a godfather or godmother for my children. That's a legal sponsor. A Catholic would tell you, you cannot have, even if I'm married to a Catholic and Muslim, I cannot let my kids have their religious law determined by somebody that doesn't know it. So a Christian and a Jew could not guide the religious law of my children because they don't know it. And that's all that passage says. The Wahhabis changed it to friends in order to use it in a supremacist fashion. There's other passages, that, especially chapter 9, it's referred to as the passage of the sword, etc. And some of those battles are specific battles where God told Muslims that you can defend yourselves and kill them where you find them, is the passage probably that you may refer to frequently, I'm sure. Again, if our commanders in the field in Afghanistan met before a battle and told our troops, kill the Taliban where you find them, that would be a very moral thing to say. So if you have a specific passage in the Quran referring to a battle that happened in 615 AD or CE, and Muslims are told, kill this tribe where you find them because they violated a pact, they've done this, and it's a just war, that doesn't mean that it applies to every century for thereafter.
Want to get in a current event here before we go back in the audience. Undoubtedly, Doctor, you've seen the photograph of the American soldiers who urinated on these people who in Afghanistan. Is this going to trigger a new round of violence against us because there are people who are incensed in that region?
Well, I'll tell you, there's been no bigger advocate of free speech than I, and whether it's I'm in Florida, the little nutty pastor that was in Florida here that wanted to burn the Quran, or others, he has a right to do whatever he wants. I mean, that's free speech. These guys don't have the right to do that. These are Marines. They don't have free speech. They're under orders. They're representing the military. They're representing all of us.
It was an inflammatory action.
It was an inflammatory action, and unfortunately, it will be used to hurt other Americans, to hurt others in the area. It'll harm our mission significantly. I mean, to me, there's nobody that's done more to help Muslims in that area of the world than our troops. They have done more for the Muslim populations than they've been able to do for themselves against thugs from their society, like the Taliban and others. And unfortunately, I mean, look at what Al Jazeera did with Abu Ghraib. It was a psychiatric experiment what Al Jazeera did with the images of Abu Ghraib in 04 and 05 over and over. It was like more repetitive than any experiment you could show. And it radicalized thousands of Muslims, I'm sure, if not millions. So that's what this video will be used for, and hopefully these guys will have the book thrown at them. And if YouTube was smart, I think it should be removed because it is a security threat.
Let's go back in the audience now. And your question or comment for Dr. Jasser. Go ahead, sir.
Hello.
Go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Jasser. I work with a counterterrorism group with Tom Trento, UnitedWest.org, and we go around here specifically in the state of Florida fighting many Islamic groups, and specifically Ahmed Badir down in South Tampa area, Imam Musri in Central Florida. I mean, the host of people that are here. I mean, Parvez Ahmed, University of North Florida, former board of director of CARE. He's teaching freely, teaching Sharia finance and advocating in defense of Free Samuel Arian, convicted, admitted terrorist. Also down in South Florida, you recently had an article that you wrote about the events that happened in Tampa recently. How do we, combat, messages like, your message is the message that we like to hear, we like to, get behind, yet these other messages that are here are diametrically opposed to your message. And you wrote an article recently down about the CARE representative down in the Miami area who's supporting a similar.
We're kind of fighting
trade.
time on this.
Yeah, no. I'm trying to say, how do we combat as citizens of Florida, as citizens of the United States, to these CARE groups where we're called haters and demagogues and whatever, similarly to the way you are? How do we combat that as citizens here in Florida?
It creates such a stain. How do you fight that?
Yeah, I think the important thing for you to do to come out of here thinking is to shift the paradigm. Because right now, so much of the paradigm in America is focused on identity politics, which is one side of the country says that, well, we are the side that's going to protect Muslims from all the civil rights abuses, from Islamophobia. Another side of the country says that, well, we're the ones that are going to protect America from the security threat. And in the meantime, the vast majority of America is sort of stuck in the middle, not knowing, well, they know that not all Muslims are a security threat, but they also know that not all Muslims are discriminated against. So somehow, how do we come out of that? And we have to get out of that paradigm and say that we want to recognize that there's a difference between Muslims that are practicing their faith and Islamists that believe in a political ideology. And that it's not anti-Islam and anti-Muslim to want to understand whether the Muslims you're talking to are engaging with, what their stance is on Islamism. And what's Islamism? Islamism is the belief that in societies where Muslims are a majority, not in America, in societies where they're a majority, or in organizations where they may be a majority in some of these Muslim organizations, that they should run it based on Islamic law, based on where the cleric decides, or the clerics amongst themselves decide what laws should be practiced, and that should be the guiding principles. And what happens is if Muslims are living in this country advocating for that, it creates an identity problem with their kids. Because their kids say, you know what, this society is not Islamic and I want to create an Islamic one. That schism in their heart between bonding to this country is a radicalizing process. And the individuals he mentioned, Mr. Bernier here in Florida, was in Phoenix last week, 3 weeks ago, giving a sermon at the largest mosque in Phoenix, and he spent 10 minutes telling the Muslims there that you have this doctor here in town, and he didn't name my name, that went and gave testimony to Congress about how all Muslims are terrorists and how all Muslims are this and that, and basically saying that you guys need to become more politically active in order to counter the anti-Islamic behavior of Muslims. And he said he wouldn't even say that I was in their community. And he came from Florida to do that in Phoenix. So what's happening is these guys feel the threat, but not enough Muslims are waking up. And what we need to do is get Muslims engaged in this process to begin to have all of the Muslims because the Muslims that go to mosque and are already engaged are often the ones that are already very politically active as Muslims. But the ones that are doctors and lawyers and engineers and pharmacists and in the Rotary Club and civics clubs, etc., typically aren't yet motivated. And we have to light a fire under their feet to get them to get engaged, to show that we are actually the silent majority, that the Islamists that are going around bad-mouthing many of us, that actually we do love our faith. We want our kids to be very devout Muslims, but we don't want them to be part of this global Islamic movement. And you can do that. You don't have to be an expert in Quranic scripture in order to get Muslims motivated. You have enough universities around here where you can start having panels, discussions about what's the threat of, is there a threat with Sharia, is there not a threat, what's political Islam versus Islam, and if I can add one thing, I wrote an op-ed, one of the candidates, Mr. Kane, had said in the campaign that he would never hire a Muslim to his cabinet. And I wrote an op-ed in a conservative blog, basically saying on the Daily Caller, I said, if only he had said Islamist. that would have been a lot better. And I think that's the type of education we need to have.
You're listening to a live town hall on WNDB Daytona Beach. We're here at Embry Riddle Aeronautical University at the Captain Willie Miller Building, Gail Lemrod Auditorium. Our guest is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. We're going to go back in the audience, but you mentioned Sharia law. Comes up often on the talk show in the community. Matter of fact, the Florida legislature actually has had to look at that issue. They've had it brought to their attention. Is this just noise, or is there real room for discussion? Should we be having discussion about the application of Sharia law in this country?
We absolutely should. To me, Sharia law is the instrument by which political Islam weaves its way into the mindset of Muslims and our communities. But you can't, just like the word Islam, Sharia to a Muslim means the path to God. That's what it literally means, the path to the watering hole to God. And ultimately, so you can't demonize the term, but yet the law itself is a body of jurisprudence. There is a body of jurisprudence that is Sharia law. Within it is tons of laws that are just incompatible with Western society. So until Muslims start making it, we can sit down and many Muslims will say, oh, we don't practice those laws. Okay, that's fine. But where are your imams that have written books that have relegated those laws to the 12th century? They're hard to find. They're there. That's where I've learned it from. I didn't learn this from, nowhere. They're there, but they're not dominating the discourse. We have a coalition that we formed called the American Islamic Leadership Coalition that includes over 20 Muslim groups like ours, American Islamic Congress, Lib for All, Muslim Canadian Congress, a number of North American Muslim organizations. We came together and supported the Michigan bill. The Michigan bill was very clear, 2 pages. It says, there shall be no courts in Michigan or in the country that shall use foreign law that will ever trump or subordinate state or federal law. Now that sounds like the obvious, and Oklahoma, I think, is learning its lesson. It did it the bad way. Yes, 70% of Oklahomans supported the Sharia law amendment there, but it was struck down because it identified Sharia law specifically. And you can't do that. It would be like identifying Talmudic law, canon law. Each of our faith has its own legal system, and you really get into a major problem with First Amendment religious freedom exercise problems if you start identifying one specific faith. But if you identify that no other legal system, period, shall ever trump state or federal law, you then protect women, for example, that get told that ecclesiastical law will trump their ability to divorce their husbands. There was a case here in Florida where there was a mosque where the board had a contract dispute with a previous board, and the court refused to rule in their favor because the court said, well, this is between two, this is within a mosque, we're going to allow ecclesiastical law to take precedence. And it even has stood appeal so far. And that concerns me because there are things that happen, and I don't know enough of the details off the top of my head right now, but there are things that happen in that contractual dispute that should be accountable to your state law that we're not. And this is what happens with arbitration systems. In this country, we preserve arbitration and we immunize it from any external review. And that needs to change, and that's what some of these laws are about.
Let's go back in the audience now. Your question, Ray Sanchez for Dr. Jasser.
Dr. Jasser, thank you for coming. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Do you see a danger of enclaves throughout the United States growing even further because of the way that American culture has, over decades, gone to multiculturalism and such, and even the erosion of Americanism being taught in our schools, our own schools, where we see it not being a strong subject anymore? Do you see a danger of enclaves continuing on so that Sharia does become more prominent throughout many cities in the United States?
I think as long as things continue without having many like you become ambassadors of this idea of starting to push political Islam, etc., it will continue to move in that direction. America has been headed there much more slowly, though, than Europe. I think Europe is a perfect example. Europe, I think the reason America has been a little more immunized is because we are a country based in a concept and ideology of immigration, in that we're much more open to this salad bowl, if you will, or melting pot of different cultures. And while Europe is much more land-based, racially based, etc., so I've gone and spoken to the Netherlands and in France, and I'll talk to Muslims there that have kids in 8th, 9th grade that will go 3-4 months without talking to a non-Muslim because there's not that much integration. Now, America is not even close to that, but we're headed in that direction as long as the sentiment where you have so many elephants in the room that nobody's talking about, where we continue to separate and we're not getting to the core problems. And we sort of need a 12-step program to counter our multiculturalism and get to what it exactly is. And when I talked to the mayor of Amsterdam, I said, the way you counter a lot of the sectarian problems between Muslims and non-Muslims is to, and when I talked to the Muslims, many of them, even though they hadn't talked to non-Muslims, you asked them, do you want to go back to Morocco? Would you want to go back to a non-Muslim country that your family came from? Pretty much every one of them said no, because they knew that they were living somewhere better than where their families came from. But they couldn't articulate why, because the Dutch hadn't taught their kids what it meant to be Dutch. And we have the same problem. Our kids in our schools don't understand what it is to be an American, and that doesn't pressure the parents to try to teach their kids that home is not Pakistan or Syria, home is America, and what does it mean here ideologically to belong to this country.
Before we go back in the audience, precious minutes left. One of the greatest changeovers of cities in the world to Muslim is London. Have you been to London, and what's it like?
I've not been there recently. I've talked to, I have a number of good friends in the Henry Jackson Society there, and I will tell you, if you look at some of the changes in London, they learned a lesson far before we did. They had what was called the PREVENT program, and in the PREVENT program, they engaged back in 2005 almost every Muslim organization they could that condemned terrorism. And recently, the Prime Minister gave a speech last February in which he talked about in the speech in Munich, and he said, it is time for us to abandon multiculturalism. We've realized that when we engage these groups, we actually created and helped facilitate more radicalization. And the PREVENT program was a failure, and they said, now we're going to start taking sides within the Muslim community with those that have adapted to British identity. And the Prime Minister identified that it was an identity problem, not an ideological problem. 81% of British Muslims in the last poll there said that they were that they were Muslim first and British second. That's even higher. In America, it's 48% in a similar poll. So they have a huge identification problem, and that's what they're going to start treating. They realize that the way they've addressed it has really been poorly done. And that's why they have many large organizations that are on the edge of advocating terrorism. Muhajirun had conferences of 10, 15,000 where they basically said 9/11 was a great thing and said so many things that were offensive. And finally, they were shut down by Prime Minister Brown.
Let's go back in the audience now. And your question for Dr. Jasser.
It's been reported that in California, some of the school districts there have set up specifically Muslim schools, and they bus the children there and they don't integrate them, I guess would be the word, with the other students. Have you heard about that, or is that some kind of propaganda?
I've not heard about the California situation, but I will tell you there's a case in Minnesota, and I'd ask you to look up it's one of the academies, TEZA, I think, TEZA Academy, which basically was a school that was a charter school, was getting tax subsidy, but yet was an Islamic school where they had prayers 5 times a day, and there were things going on in the school that were much more like a parochial private school. And once that was exposed by a reporter there, Catherine, trying to remember her last name, but she did some wonderful reporting there with the Star Tribune and exposed what was happening. ACLU got on the case, sued the school on behalf of the families, etc., for not separating church or religion and state, and the school now has been shut down. And I think that was a case that will be used not only in Minneapolis and in Minnesota, but nationally, to show that many of these charter, and that maybe some charter schools in California you're talking about, that are sort of religious-based schools that have been able to walk that line will not be able to. But I mean, America is actually much less, again in the Netherlands, do you know that in the Netherlands, The population funds religious schools, and that's their concept of not separating religion and state, is that they need to fund religious schools in order to appear fair in their distribution of tax monies. So you've got 180 Islamic schools in the Netherlands that are funded by the Dutch government.
In the audience, we'll come back we have just a few minutes left for questions, and then we're going to wrap up tonight here at Embry Riddle. Thank you for being with us.
I'm interested in, I'm interested in what you said about identifying as Americans. I spent a lot of time in California and understand what you're talking about because I saw this happen with the Latino community. As the children grew up as Latino Americans, they then became Americans, and there's hardly any way to differentiate them. Most of them speak Spanish, most of them are bilingual, which is an asset. My concern is with a Muslim community, especially for young women, is how can they identify American and still wear the veil?
Well, you know, my mother and my wife's family, a number of women in our families wear the hijab and feel, I mean, we have women in our Liberty Project that are Muslim women that feel that this country gives them, like no other country, the choice to wear it, and that they want to wear it or not. That as long as it's not their father or their brother or their husband telling them to wear it, then they feel that it's truly more their choice as to why they want to wear it. And ultimately, it's actually, for many women that wear the veil, it's a very feminist thing. They don't want to be looked upon in a physical way. They want to be respected for their mind, etc., and not for the physical attributes that may be part of one of the negative aspects of this culture, which is exploitation of women, etc. So that actually, to them, that challenge of growing up in this environment is far more preferable. The hijab means much more if they have a choice to wear it or wear a bathing suit, that they can choose between the two. While if you're in a society like Iran, where they hit you with a stick if your skirt goes halfway up your calf, that's no longer a choice, and that's not being a human being. So to them, there's nothing more American than that choice. And I think, in countries like France, that created a policy that outlawed it, that was fuel for Islamism, and it created a lot of anti-French sentiment, and it affected Jews and Christians and others who couldn't wear their own religious articles too.
Dr. Jasser, can you confirm or dismiss a common statement that part of the problem that extreme Muslims have with Americans is that we consume a lot? We consume more material, energy, and things on the planet, that we do a lot. Do they resent that because they have so little?
Boy, that's an interesting
countries?
question. I think, to me, one of the funniest aspects of Islamism is it's sort of this nexus. They're on the, if you look at American politics, they're on the far right on social family values, but they're on the far left as far as nanny state and socialism, if you will. And that's if you look at the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, that's their platform. Government is the solution for health care, welfare, everything. And you also need the government to institute family values and anti-gay marriage, all that kind of stuff. So it's sort of this nexus. It's split. They look upon capitalism more as capitalist, which is actually not the word from Adam Smith, but more for free markets and liberty and etc. When in fact I was taught that there's nothing more Islamic than free markets. That ultimately you don't want the government interfering, that less taxation is good. So a lot of these concepts, to me, I was raised that it's interesting. If you look even at zakat itself, which is charity, zakat as a Muslim is based on 2.5% of your savings.
Like a tithe.
Of your savings, though, not a tithe of your income. It's of your savings, so or your assets. So therefore, actually, I was raised that consumption is a good thing. My grandfather used to tell me that if God didn't want us to spend it, he would not charge us on our savings. Because ultimately, when you spend something, and this isn't to say that you should do it in extravagance, but if you spend something, you're employing somebody else. That goes to a business. And so a lot of this concept, yes, you're right, the Brotherhood paints the West, and this is what Qutb did when he came to Colorado. He said, this country is all gluttony and consumption, etc.
Yeah,
this is what the Brotherhood says. But the bottom line is By the way, there's no bigger gluttons than the Saudi royal family and what they spend. They'll put gold-plated wheels on their cars, and it's just absurd. But anyway, the consumption creates a significant amount of employment, and there's a lot of...
It drives commerce, and that's a good thing.
Exactly.
Finally, the Detroit News wrote that the largest concentration of faith-based Arabs in this country live in the Detroit metro area. Do they get it in terms of understanding your message, or do you have to really work hard to plow through? Because they're better educated, they have built businesses, and they're also concentrated. They're very much neighborhood. Do they understand what you talk about?
Well, I think I'd be careful in ever sort of generalizing on any community. I've gone and spoken in the Detroit area a number of times. University of Michigan, I spoke there at Ann Arbor, and you know, there were a number of Muslims that came, and some were very against what I said, and some were very much in favor. It's interesting, especially like at the law schools. I spoke at University of Iowa Law School in the fall, and a number of Muslims came up to me afterwards and thanked me. You know, and it almost seems like the more educated they are in the legal systems, et cetera, the more they really appreciate what we're doing. But I will tell you, actually, the bigger challenge, I think, if I was to generalize, is the communities with higher populations like Chicago and Los Angeles, because there's so much inbreeding as far as ideas, where, you know, I grew up in a town with 3 families. Now there's a lot more in northern Wisconsin, but my parents built the first mosque in northeastern Wisconsin. So, you know, when you grow up in that environment as a devout Muslim, you either become not religious and you just sort of, you know, Muslim is a label, an identity, but you don't understand your faith, or if you're going to understand it, you really have to study it, understand it, but you identify with the culture which doesn't have that many Muslims, versus in Dearborn and elsewhere, you could, you know, spend 90% of your life surrounded by Muslims and in many ways forget all the different diversity that's in America.
Finally, one of our favorite people in Washington at a think tank is Frank Gaffney. Yeah, if memory serves me correctly, about 5 years ago, you were honored at his center for your studies and your work. Tell our audience about that.
Well, you know, the Center for Security Policy has been one of the think tanks that's, I think, been doing a lot of the leading work and lives on that edge of trying to awaken America to threats and on many fronts. And Frank had, one of his projects had been to look at the work of Muslims that are battling this idea. And actually, you know, to his credit, the title of the film was Islam versus Islamists. And he worked with Martin Burke, who put together this film, and they profiled six of us in Europe, Canada, and the U.S. that are doing this work. And PBS was supposed to fund it. I think they ended up funding parts of it, and but then they wouldn't air it because for many reasons, and Frank ended up having to get legal action against them, and then they aired it, but after the fact. But again, it showed, and many of these Muslims now that were in that film are now part of our coalition, our American Islamic Leadership Coalition, and it showed the struggle. They came to Arizona, and 8 minutes of the film you'll see of the imams that I'm dealing with in Phoenix and some of the struggles that we've had. And you know, he every year recognizes people that are keepers of the flame of freedom, and I was humbled to be part of that.
Congratulations. Our next event will be Tuesday night. We're right back here for a real troublemaker. Christine O'Donnell, former United States Senate candidate, a couple of times in Delaware, is out with a book called Troublemaker. And she'll tell us why things that were said and done to her would repel anybody from ever thinking of getting into politics. She will tell her story here as part of her nationwide tour at the next President Speakers event, and it will be live on WNDB as well. So we invite you to come, free and open to the public. I want to thank Richard and Clinton and Alyssa, who all helped produce tonight's event, to our partners at Tiger Bay Club for their generosity in sharing Dr. Jasser with us, and to my executive producer, Phil Kincaid, who ran everything so that this could be back up on our website, marcberniershow.com. As well, you will see it at erau.edu as part of the video presentations. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Thank you all for being here tonight. Enjoy your weekend.